Hello, good evening everybody at the Orange Tribune, and welcome those in person, and good evening everyone at home or watching via YouTube tonight or in the coming days through the website. Hello, happy known faces. There are some known faces also around. Thanks for coming, thanks for joining. I'm very happy to be having this panel here that will be properly introduced by Christopher Marcinkoski, who came all the way from Philadelphia yesterday. There's no jet lag, so everything is fine. He will be moderating a panel which is called, this time is a long one, I would say, but I want to say, probable, plausible, possible, preferable. Imagine the future before it's too late. I think that the subtitle reveals everything much better. I also want to thank Roy, Jesse, Felix, Angeliki, and Heidi that will be introducing themselves later for being here tonight. I'm very happy that Chris is moderating this panel tonight. I know Chris for 12 years, something like that. So we have been working together in several topics. But what brought us together in a way, professionally, is speculation, but real estate speculation. So Christopher, many years ago, started doing research and several studios and writing a book about real estate speculation in Spain and then in Africa. And then he has recently edited a journal, an issue of a journal, LA Plus, on speculation in a much broader sense. And we have had, during this year, quite so many conversations about the speculation, and not only real estate speculation. So I'm also interested in speculation because, well, I started analyzing or trying to understand what happened with real estate speculation, but we are going to leave it for the last part of my conversation. We also have today here Felix Madrazo, again, who has been working third time, I think. So I think you are the record. Third time again, but he had to be here. He has been teaching at the Y Factory for ever, and a place where I work, where I have been working with Vinny Mas, Felix, Lex, and Adrian for also many years. The Y Factory, and some of you know, speculates about the future and produces visions about, let's say, probable, possible, preferable, optimistic futures always. We tell our students, let's not do dystopia, sorry, let's try to work on utopias and look at the optimistic futures. It's very funny because, well, we have this agenda, and this is a very arguable one, and I learned this the other time. There are many ways of looking at planetary urgencies in general. That's our agenda, not our agenda, but our list. This is also our list of what is it that we want the planet to be like, and this is also very arguable, no? But in any case, we look at the future in many ways. We produce visualizations. Some of them have been done. All of this that you're seeing has been done by our students, mostly here in Delft, and many of them probably tutored by Felix, who's sitting behind me tonight, no? In any case, as I was saying, it's funny because today one student asked me, why do you make us produce buildings that fly? And that was a really interesting conversation because, yes, well, because the student was telling me the flying is expensive. Why do we work with zero gravity? Why do we do the things that we do? And I think it's really interesting as a question. And what I told him is that maybe it's good that we, for one semester, work and live without gravity. That we, let's say, don't have to depend on it. That we liberate ourselves from constraints like that and imagine. And this is what we try to do at the Y Factory, what have been trying to do at the Y Factory with Vinny, with Felix, with Lex, etc., and so many, no? And in any case, we look at possible futures, as you can see over here, in many, many ways that try to respond to this kind of agenda that we have produced for ourselves. In any case, these are possible futures that I don't want to be detailing. I could be talking about, well, how do we respond to housing necessities? How do we respond to the necessity of being greener or not, etc., etc.? It is up to discussion, and I hope that the panel tonight will let us know what they think about imagination, about futuring, about the future, etc., etc. Because they know a lot more than I do about it. No? But in any case, we have been working on visualization, on trying to understand the future for many years at the Y Factory. Not only at the Y Factory, but we also tried to make a call to visionaries. Visionaries have existed for many, many years, and this is something that we are not inventing. No? Vinny is not the first visionary. He knows very well. No? And when we were editing Domus, we did sort of a call to imagination, and the last issue was devoted to these visions that have been produced by authors previously, and visions that are being produced by authors currently and students. This is actually a student work from Hong Kong, or a student work from Strelka in Moscow, or a student work from MIT, or a student work from Penn. This is the work done by the speculative side of Christopher when he's teaching at Penn. At the end of the day, what we try to do is this. No? These two guys luckily are gone, or not luckily, I don't know. But they are gone, but what we could try to do is to imagine other futures, imagine other worlds. That's what we do at the Y Factory, and in many ways. The problem is that, let me get you back to reality. The problem is that our world leaders are still dreaming of visions like this. This is an article I texted Chris immediately when I was reading this, and I told Christopher, now I know what I'm going to talk about when I present this. This is this Bitcoin city that has just been launched and is being designed in El Salvador. This is the Twitter of the president of El Salvador, whose name I cannot read from here, and I'm very sorry. So this is a tax haven made out of, it doesn't really matter what the process is, because what is really interesting is that this world leader, or a president of a country, is actually proposing that our lives will be around this. No? And then this is when you are working at the Y Factory or trying to think of better futures, you get to the reality of one world leader who is telling you that the future should be like this. It's not going to be gold, at least. It's going to be, he says, don't worry, it's gold, because the architect wanted it to be gold, but it's going to be green. And this is the green future for Bitcoin City that the president of El Salvador is actually proposing. So I would like that the conversation moves probably away from this reality and the creation of certain kinds of future with whom maybe we feel a little bit more uncomfortable, and try to think in a different way. As I said, calling all visionaries. I also had the curiosity to try to understand who's behind such a Bitcoin city, and this is Fernando Romero. Maybe some of you know him better than I do. Because, of course, all these projects are done with the complicity of design. And design and designers are doing this project. So you, as students, need to know that one day you will be asked to make Bitcoin City. It's up to you to decide whether you want to do it or not. I don't know. We are not here to do that. In any case, the panel tonight aims at calling visionaries, at talking maybe about other things, and try to see if we can move away from the Bitcoin world that some presidents of El Salvador are proposing. Or maybe you want to support that, but let's simply talk about it. So I'm going to give the word to my colleague and my friend Christopher, who came all the way from Philadelphia, and he will run the show tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier, for the introduction and for the invitation to be with you all today. Thank you all for coming who are here in person, those of you online or watching after the fact. And maybe most of all, thank you to my panelists up here who are joining me and are actually going to do all of the work today. I am just the igniter, and then I'm going to sort of get away from the firework. This is great because, you know, for me, this is actually one of the first in-person events that I've gotten to do since the pandemic. So it was worth flying across the ocean for this, and I hope the discussion will be, you know, as exciting as Javier has set it up to be. A little bit of background, I'm an architect, an urbanist. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. I am not an expert on speculation or on the future. But as Javier mentioned, a great deal of my work has engaged with ideas of speculation in terms of both phenomenon and also speculation as a design method. And so for almost a decade now, I've been sort of working through these two aspects of it and sort of thinking about how we as urbanists think about the future and how these two intersect with one another, come together. So I think I can sort of at least offer some provocations as we move into our discussion this afternoon. As Javier mentioned, I just recently finished editing an issue of LA+, which is an interdisciplinary journal based out of Penn, which tries to intersect the notion of speculation as a kind of financial or economic product versus speculation, again, as a methodology or a kind of design structure or pedagogy. But frankly, enough about me, as I am joined here with 5 people who can speak in a much greater depth to some of these issues that Javier's put on the table today, particularly in relationship to ideas of tools, to methods, to values, and the products of speculation in the future, in both critical and divergent ways. I'm going to actually ask each of them to introduce themselves. I think it's much more interesting to hear somebody talk about their work as opposed for me to read off a bio. But before I do that, I just want to set the terms of engagement that we all agreed to on our call last week. First of all, there are a set of themes that I think are going to come out in this conversation. I'm not going to necessarily focus us in order of them because I think they will organically occur. But if we start to go too far down one line, I will stop the discussion and move us back into our focus. Really, the second piece that I want to focus on and remind everybody of is a commitment to avoid academic jargon. I think we all talked about that. That's going to be a challenge given the group that's up here, but we will do our best. I think the reason for that very much is that this is intended to be a conversation and a discussion, a real dialogue where we're thinking through things and we're not presenting things. We're not making necessarily presentations or declarations, although maybe some declarations might come about. You will see behind us at some point this afternoon a series of images that the panelists have submitted. 1 to 3 images each will go on a kind of loop. And this is sort of fodder to prompt thinking, both for you, the audience, but also us on the panel. And the only rule that goes along with that is that no one is allowed to speak to their own images unless they have been asked to speak to them. So we can talk about each other's images, but not our own. Again, this is very much about dialogue and discourse. And at the end, we'll hold time for questions so that you all can sort of participate in this thinking through with us and joining in that discussion. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And though this is an in-person event, we've been Zoomified over the past 2.5 years. So we're going to use the popcorning method of introduction, where I will call on one person, they will introduce themselves, say a little bit about their work, say a little bit about how they come to this topic and how they engage with it, and then throw it off to the next person before we dive into questions. So the professional at these BK talks is Felix. So perhaps we'll start with Felix's introduction and move on from there.
Thanks, Chris, for your introduction, and thanks, Javier, also for the invitation. It's a bit embarrassing to be here again, to see you, but it's at the same time exciting, of course. For me, very, very simple. My life is a bit weird, but if you could address it in the context of this, in today's discussions, is that I have an office which mostly deals with the present. I have a collective of friends, mostly Latin Americans, who we try to understand the present with a huge lens towards the past. It's called Super Sudaca. And I've been teaching here in the Y Factory, mostly focusing on the speculations of the future. So in a way, I try to understand all kinds of situations by this. And they are all many times contradictory. So I'm not very much consistent, and you can cut me very much in doing like, paradoxical stuff. So talking about contradictions, maybe let's go to the Greek side.
Contradiction between Greece and Mexico. Thank you very much. Christopher, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome at the U Delft. Thank you for flying across the Atlantic for us. Thank you very much to the audience and to Javier for organizing this talk. My name is Angeliki Sioli. I'm not in the chair of the Y Factory, which does amazing work. But I actually came to the UELF to work at a different chair, titled Chair of Methods of Analysis and Imagination. So you can understand from the title of the chair that looking into the future and envisioning possibilities and scenarios is very much at the core of our work and what really intrigues me in working with the students. We look into how imagination works in the brain from a neuroscience perspective, what kind of different ways of imaginations are there that we can use in our work. And we try to engage both in education and research on this topic. My own involvement comes from a big passion for literature. I always wanted to be a writer. It's a dream for the future, maybe another life. And I am always fascinated by how writers, authors, poets are able to imagine whole worlds. They do way more than architects do, and this is super fascinating and extremely valuable for our work here. And we can talk more about that later. And I'm going to turn to my colleague here.
So we're doing first the right side of the room. So thank you, Christopher, for the introduction, and also Javier for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. I'm Jesse Hoffmann. I work as a researcher and a teacher at Utrecht University, the geosciences faculty in a team that is called the Urban Future Studio. I'm a political scientist by training, but I think, yeah, the future has grown on me. Also the past, by the way, but the future as a topic. And I think that's mainly because of on the topics I've been working with, it's sort of been a topic that has helped me to really start to think differently about academic life, about how the university can sort of reposition itself in society rather than just studying and critiquing what's happening out there, to actually becoming a part of it. And at the Urban Future Studio, I think that is something that I share with my colleagues, and what we actually try to do. And then futuring and all of those difficult concepts around it are kind of the grammar and the techniques that help us facilitate sort of these new situations, happenings in the street and other places. And then, so we were asked to bring in pictures today, but I think my interest is much more in physical events. Well, great to be here, but then physical events and how do we stage a conversation around the future, and how does it actually, how do we experience actually in real life, and what does that mean politically and socially? So I turn it over to the other Mexican side of the room.
We're taking over. Well, thanks a lot for the popcorn, and thanks Javier, especially for this really kind invitation, and for Chris for having organized all this for us today. I mean, well, I'm going to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Heidi Zohn. I am Associate Professor of Architecture Theory. I am also the head of the small Architecture Philosophy and Theory group here at the faculty. And well, tonight I'm actually here in a way because I'm not dead, and I think that is why this topic is so exciting. If the future and speculating or thinking about the future doesn't entice us and doesn't make our heart start beating faster, something must be quite wrong with us. Something with our lifeline is a bit disturbed, I believe. So that's where I start. I am also going to very clearly say it from the beginning. I have absolutely no authority whatsoever in topics about futurity and futurology and futurism. I have read a few books by Alvin Toffler, of course, and maybe I could throw in a Fukuyama book or two, but I don't consider myself at all an expert on the future. And I'm also absolutely not into any of the statistics of the possible, the plausible, and so on. So what I'm going to do tonight, I think, is I'm going to throw 3 more P's into the mix of our 4 P's. One is process, the other is production, or the productive, and the other is philosophy. So from that point of view, I'm going to launch some of my thoughts around this really interesting horizon event, if you like, or event horizon, that is the future, thinking through really the thing that brought me here, that brought us all of us here, which is difference, right? So I could talk a lot about how philosophy is essentially about the future. What I want to do tonight is, from my part, is to say how the future is actually a collective, creative, generative environment, possibility for us to think through civilizational projects that are not necessarily in some temporality far out in the future, but that really are about exploring the potentials, the transformative potentials of the present. So it is through that understanding of difference, I'm going to throw in a jargon here. It's actually nomenclature, which is heterogenesis. that the world comes to be. So tonight I'm going to try to launch from there into this collective project called The Future. And I popcorn it to you.
I'm the closer. Yes. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Javier, for the invitation. I want to catch up to Felix, so I expect a third one anytime soon. I'm gunning for you. My name is Roy Bender. I'm an assistant professor of critical design in the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering, which is almost across the street, diagonally. My background is in media studies and philosophy of technology and environmental communication. Most of what I do today is try to think about ways that future thinking and design making can come together. I see my mission as utilizing the power of design to help us think and pursue alternative futures, and I think we all have this, in common, kind of a strong dissatisfaction with the present and a desire to see things change. I got into futures as a postdoc out of work on sustainability and out of a kind of realization that if sustainability is anything, it is about reconsidering the future, and that came through through my involvement with a fantastic group of futurists and artists and sustainability practitioners and a group called Disruptive Imaginings, and that really inspired me to think about how all of these different ways to see the world and to bring it to life could actually function in a very kind of strong, mutually productive way, and that led me to design, which I think is a fantastic discipline, both because it's a kind of a glue that could stick different disciplines together, but also because I think it has all of the means that we need to bring the future to life, to let us experience it, to let us feel it and rehearse it, try it out for size, and hopefully open up new possibilities. So that's what brings me here.
Excellent. So, if you happen to look at the written bios that accompany these individuals and sort of study them, there are a number of words that show up across the bios. Things like politics, society, climate change, systems, sustainability, imagination, models, worlding, and representation, to name just a few. So to begin our conversation, I'd like to take up the consideration of a theme that I think cuts across these words and these ideas and these topics, which is a consideration of method. And so I'm particularly interested in considering notions of rigor and criticality as it relates to the question of method in terms of futuring and in terms of design speculation, particularly in the context where the term speculation is often used to delineate things that are unserious or frivolous, or at least appear to be unserious or frivolous. And so while I think everybody on this panel probably has something to say about methods, Roy, I'd like to start with you. And I'd like to start by paraphrasing a quote from an essay that you shared with me, which is, because every method we use to navigate future uncertainty comes with an intellectual baggage, we should ask ourselves what kind of unspoken assumptions or hidden intentions underlie, and here's my modification, the future.
Wow, you're throwing me back at me. Oh God, what was I thinking? I want to start by thinking about speculation as a way of knowledge production, and I think it's quite special. Most knowledge production is either about the past. We have data of things that happen, or we look at the present and we try to analyze it. But any kind of research about future knowledge essentially looks at a lack of data. What are we studying? Things that haven't happened yet. And that means that it's very, very hard to apply any kind of rigor and any kind of standards and measurements to the knowledge produced by speculation based on standards that are developed by the other sciences. Which is to say that we kind of need our own type of understanding of, or our own understanding of the type of knowledge produced by speculation. I'm not weaseling myself out of this question, but if speculation is kind of its own kind of knowledge, right, and we need to think about what comes as sort of success criteria, so to speak. We have to think about what are we trying to do with speculation. And here I want to throw in a first distinction that I'm pretty sure will come later on as well, and that is between, shall we say, prediction or forecasting and foresight. Because I think they each come with their own kind of type of knowledge and their own assumptions, which bring us back to that assumption. So in a nutshell, forecasting is an attempt to kind of cut through the uncertainty of the future and figure out what is the most plausible thing that might happen, and then it allows us to orient action in that way. And in a sense, it controls the future. That's what we try to do. We look at a kind of a cone of possibilities, and we look for the one that we want, and that's what we're gunning for. And on the other hand, foresight takes that very same uncertainty and uses it as a material to think about possibility. So the idea here is not to find the most plausible path in all future possibilities, but actually to expand the cone of possibility itself. So if we're thinking about speculation as a form of prediction or forecasting, then it's quite easy to know what is rigorous or not rigorous. And I mean, you know, the proof is in the pudding. You predict something. Did it happen? Great. You're right. Did it not happen? Well, you're wrong. And if you're if you're speculating on real estate, that could be, you know, quite costly. But what are you know, how can we measure what we speculate? And so for me, from my position, the kind of power and the knowledge that come from speculation is about the kind of conditions and limitations of action, because all action is oriented towards the future. And so, you know, maybe one way to think about the knowledge that's produced here and to think about it rigorously is to think about whether it expands what we can act on and how we can act on. How we think about the consequences of our action, whether we can extend them in time and in space, and whether that creates, shall we say, a new type of agency that allows us maybe to see action and to pursue it in a different way.
So just to not leave that point, but to maybe come at it from the other side, Angeliki, I wonder if you can talk about literature and world building, because Roy's sort of mentioning data and measure and sort of means of evaluation as a way of understanding a future. But literature also offers another way of thinking through, and I would say not just representing, but actually thinking through a set of possible futures.
Thank you very much for bringing the conversation to the other side. Because before I'm going to answer this question, I want to add something to the very beautiful comments about forecasting and seeing the future. You closed your train of thought by saying what is our commitment and how we're going to act and to what we have an obligation in order to act towards the future. And you very cleverly went all around about our ethical responsibility towards the future. Sorry, I'm not answering the question right away, which is a very big question here, and it's something I would really like us to discuss. And I know that it doesn't start with a P, but when I saw the title of today's talk, the possible, the probable, I thought, where is the appropriate? Because anything is possible nowadays. We can really do anything. We have the technology, we have the means. It's a fantastic period if you think like that. It's absolutely mesmerizing. But what is appropriate is the big question for the future, and if we need the appropriate or not. And here maybe literature comes as a help, I would say, because the beauty of the work of authors and the novels that we read and short stories is that they are not asked to create only one building for the future, only one scenario. They create the whole world. For a novel to be really engaging, for a novel to be really believable, to really draw us in, that world, that future world, that imaginary future world, needs to be really believable. All the aspects need to be calibrated in such a way to make us believe, when we were reading years ago that 1984 Big Brother is a possibility, because that novel, Orwell's language, is so cleverly attuned to a particular atmosphere of place. The characters are worked to be really working around these particular conditions that we can really imagine that awful future happening. So authors have this fantastic capacity in their hands to do that, to create the whole world together. If we think of the fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty not only falls asleep for herself, the whole world around her falls asleep, and when the prince is coming to wake her up, the world is awakened again. Because what would the Sleeping Beauty do if she was awakened in 200 years from the time she went to bed and the world was different? What future would that be for her?
Heidi?
I can't help myself, and I want to jump right in there, because I don't know, Wittgenstein once said, the limit of our language is the limit of the world. And just thinking about the semiotic, how language helps us to not only render and represent, but also to construct. You mentioned 1984, which is a dystopia, more or less, of the future, which has already, caught up with us. So what I'm really interested in knowing is how, for example, through the methods of analysis and imagination, we can build more than just a semiotic environment, but how to connect that semiotic environment with the material aspects of the world. And I think that is partly of where this idea of differentiation comes in. How do we differentiate for what we can see, the ontic, what we build with our hands, and what we build with our imaginations. So I really like that the thing that the world wakes up with Sleeping Beauty. And to wrap this up, is also a political question. So of course it's the appropriate, the question of the appropriate, through the lens of what, if we think of the future as accomplished history, you would think that the history of humanity is in reality the history of the realization of the impossible, right? So that question of the appropriate, it comes to us through the material semiotic stuff. So that's...
I'm going to direct this question to you, so perfect, Hesse. This term appropriate, I think, is one that needs to be unpacked a little bit. Who's appropriate? What's appropriate? How do we define appropriate? How do we value appropriate? And so I wonder, it brings up the question of audience. It brings up a question of public. So I know, Hesse, you were going to say something, but I'm going to throw appropriate and public into whatever it was that you were about to offer in response to Heidi's comment.
Okay, so I'll use that to segue in my other question and then hopefully come back to your question, if that's all right. So I think it's sort of, obviously the future doesn't exist, so that being rigorous about that is a nonsense question, but future images or sort of imagined futures do exist, and then I think it's a question of what we look at, and that's then how does some form of an imagined future that we bring into the present together affects us, right? So how, and that's perhaps also where the sort of rigor comes in, and where rigor referring to something that's sort of fixed, or that's only a future that we actually, at least for a moment, believe in, that it exists. It doesn't matter if it actually comes about, but if we all coordinate our actions when the government says the economy is going to grow with 3%, and we all act accordingly by buying a new house or so, then that future is sort of performative, and then it becomes, and I think that's where the world building comes in as a question of, so how, to what extent does an imagined future actually affect us? And is the whole performance of it somehow rigorous? So really thought through, or do we show up in an exhibition, an image of the future, and then have a very conventional conversation around it? And I think there also the question of appropriateness comes in for me, because so I'm not sure if that's a useful contribution, but it feels to me that it's very much about actually enabling a conversation about what is desirable and appropriate. And so when the future often comes to us, it's in the form of a trend or of developments from the outside that we have to sort of be resilient to, right? We are sort of future-proof. And we only very few times have conversations about actually the future that we do want. So how do we create the emotional, tangible, experiential settings in which we actually tap into our own sort of aspirations of what is the good life, of how do we build relationships, etc. And how do we then imagine the future together in an ethical way?
Okay, I have to say something, I guess. It's funny because it's almost embarrassing maybe to think about a kind of interesting future, because it's a kind of a guilty pleasure, you know, like why would you imagine something that is so cool, you know, like everybody would be like, yeah, come on, man. I mean, the world is falling apart, and then you are like making these images that, oh, everybody's happy, come on. So I think that's, we have to work on that, I think. We have to kind of, let's say, go out of the closet and say, it's okay to think beautiful things, you know. It's okay, not everything has to be destruction and tsunamis and so on. But the question for me that Chris mentions for me is the issue of method, which in the Y Factor we we are not that scientific, so let's just bring it a little bit lower down to a kind of basic school, and we call it format. And for us in the Y Factory, the format is the most interesting thing to research, because to research the future, we don't not have to be so rigorous like a scientist, but nevertheless, we need a way to approach the future with a certain rule games. Like, so in the Y Factory, we have tried several kind of formats that explore the future with the use of computing tools, but also, and perhaps the most interesting for us, is the simulation of interaction of humans, which is the most interesting aspect for me, at least, how the future could really unravel. And the experiments we did with Ego City, which is a kind of advertising here that the book is coming that Javier will probably announce later, is one of the most interesting examples how gaming and gamification could be used as a way to predict how humans will interact with each other, instead of just you alone in your dreams, like, I imagine a future which is super green, and then, okay, and then, but then what happened to interaction, which is one of the most interesting things. That's why I like to see Franz de Waal, like his experiments with monkeys, like how they react to things which are almost so close to humans. You know, like when we talk about sustainability and climate change, it's like, but come on, it's gonna happen like in 200 years. Do I feel anything? To be honest, I don't feel anything. Like, okay, yes, we should do something for sure, but am I really feeling something? I get more scared when there's a huge bumblebee in my ear, you know? Like, how can we feel something that is so far in the distance and to act? It's a kind of paradoxical. We cannot predict so much what's gonna happen in 200 years. I mean, forget, I mean, even in last year, even before Putin invaded Ukraine, I was like, no way he's gonna do it. And oops, he did it, you know? So, and not only me, but everybody fails again and again and again. So I think study of humans, how we react, is for me the most promising format of method research.
May I? Well, for methodologies, I would guess, like understand, the visual is super important. Like, how do you engage publics? How do you convince people? You would have to have a publics that is not only sensing the climate changing and transforming rapidly. You would also need a public that is incredibly knowledgeable and actually knows how to read, right? So to read a novel, to even understand what it means to have, a science fiction about the future. So I'm wondering, what is design then? What are we doing as designers? Do we sit here and make little objects, or do we make what they call project for galleries or publication for coffee tables, books? Or is it really that what we're actually going to sit here and articulate all these chairs here, that are connecting with the articulation of design as such? So design as a powerful tool, a tool perhaps to make people aware that there is climate change, to create awareness that there are certain connections between how we speak of the world and how the world reacts back to us. So I think the methods there would be perhaps to create a sense of urgency about paradigmatic shifts. And these are not about only how you design or what you design, but it's also how do we understand the chain of knowledge production. So what types of epistemologies are we building at this level of teaching, for instance? How do we write the things that we write? How do we design? And what for? So I bring in what I recently found really interesting work from transition design, so designing for transitions, that I find incredibly interesting because they connect this visual richness and imagination to what I think is the appropriate the message behind it, which is the connection between the matter and the meaning of the world. So what type of world are we creating, not for the future, but for the here and now, which is the future in a way. So there's kind of if you need a motif, some kind of motive to work, to think what is the connection between how we act semiotically and materially. So again.
Roy, did you want to respond?
Well, I think to some extent, if we think of futuring as a process, that P, we could evaluate it as we would almost any other process of creativity, of participation, of production, absolutely. So we can say something about that. For instance, when we talk about appropriateness, we can ask appropriate to who? When we talk, say, about we, then we can ask, who is this we? Who was invited, right? Who is doing the futuring, clearly? And I think to some extent we can also look at the immediate outcomes of futuring processes insofar as what they produce to some extent is a text. And I'm expanding here text just like some people would think about a vision or a visual, right? An image as something that's not just visual, right? So we produce something that could be understood semiotically and could be analyzed in that way. I think the deeper implications of futuring and thinking about the future, insofar as what they try to do is hang on to uncertainty and turn it into a force that allows us to make reality malleable, are very, very hard to touch. Some processes are so long. You know, Rebecca Solnit, the American author, talks about, you know, whether the suffragists didn't realize that their fight is observed by Gandhi, just like Gandhi didn't realize that in the 60s the civil rights movement will be looking to his work as an inspiration, you know, and it goes on, Occupy, etc. So, you know, we don't know what effects our actions will have in the future, but that's actually good. It means that we keep opening doors, and that allows us to find new sources of agency and influence.
So, I think that's I'm gonna get Javier's money's worth for flying me over here.
Go for it.
I think this question of, Roy, what you were just bringing up, for me, gets to a sort of second theme that we sort of discussed, but I think is super important, and Felix, you touched on it, and Angelika, you touched on it, which is representation, and how you represent, and what you represent, and not just what you represent, but also what you don't represent, and this sort of degree of completion versus leaving things out, and leaving open to interpretation. And so maybe as a way of kind of taking up this notion of representation, I want to also throw in there the question of the expert versus the outsider. Because in many ways, literature is the outsider speaking or reflecting upon a set of ideas. The measure, the data, Roy, that you were speaking to oftentimes is someone with expertise or somebody who's seen as having a degree of expertise. But if we're talking about publics and we're talking about who is the we, I think we have to move beyond the expert into the outsider. And that comes back to me for representation, because representation is a way in. And it could be written, it could be visual, it could be textual, it could be a whole variety of things. So I want to come back to this idea of representation and maybe throw it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christopher. It's great, because anyhow I wanted to talk about that to some degree. I will start by what you said, what we represent, but also what we don't represent. And I wanted to ask a question of how much do we question the tools with which we're predicting or forecasting or envisioning the future. You said that at the Y Factory you use computational design, right? It has particular possibilities and other possibilities are not there. Section was not always part of the architectural vocabulary, which is a means of representation we use widely right now, but it can only show so much. It was never there before the Renaissance, right? What does a plan show? Part of the work we try to do here with the students in questioning the methods or to trying to develop methodologies is also in questioning the tools, and also question the modes of representation, and try to explore different modalities of drawing, different possibilities of models, different possibilities of writing, because we can predict as much as the tools allow us to predict. Another kind of tool would give us possibly different results or open up different possibilities. So I think this is a really important role, a really important part of our role in an educational academic environment, to really question the basics. Why do we keep drawing elevations? We know very well now that we never perceive elevations. Our experience in the city, I'm not going to use jargon, but when we walk in the city, when do I ever see the elevation, the perfect orthographic projection of an elevation of a building? That's never. A plan may be a tool for technicians, for experts, for architects, but we never present a plan to we rarely present a plan to a client, correct? So what the tools show, what the tools represent and not represent should be at the very core of our investigations regarding the future.
I don't know.
I can keep talking, I can
I
convince
don't know,
you.
I'm not so sure, because
Ask me, ask me.
elevation, it's like, is one of the first kind
You
of...
didn't show any elevations from Y factor, it was all renderings.
First formats of human representation are through elevation. Like if you just check the drawings of humans, the first representations are elevations. It's so like primary that it's like part of us. You know,
I'm
like,
questioning orthographic projections.
I'm just saying that
elevations.
there are several formats and we are exploring several formats. One of them is computing tools, and I agree with you. We have to explore several more formats. And I want to push a little bit back towards you because you are an expert on literature. And I think what Heidi was saying, that there's a limit to, since Wittgenstein, that about language. But for me, actually, I'm not so sure if that's true, because I think format, again, could play a key role to understand like things which we cannot talk about. So can you talk about war and peace, for example? Or sorry, military operation and peace, as it's called in Russia?
Can I please ask, how do you mean format? I really wanted to ask that before. How do you mean format in the way you work with the students? What do you mean by format? Because format can mean a lot of things.
Format, for example, in terms of a novel, for example, like you could have a novel that is kind of linear, or a novel that has time factors, like with returning things. Like, I want to wish that you explain to us from a writer point of view, like literature, how has explored the format of the novel? The novel was not forever, so it's a kind of way of telling things. So when Tolstoy talks about War and Peace, he's trying to invent a format, talk about something very difficult.
Yes, I completely agree.
So there's a kind of, not only language, but format. For me, that's what I want to say, format or methods in a kind of university, but
yes, I completely agree. And part of the work we do with the students is also to try through the way the writers write and the different formats to investigate different ways of approaching the future. Of course, James Joyce comes in and completely overthrows what we knew about novel up to that moment, right? Like the stream of consciousness. Suddenly we're exposed both to seeing Dublin through the eyes of Leopold Bloom and to all his inner thoughts. We know everything from his desire to go use the bathroom to when he's hungry and how he feels. And then he writes Finnegan's Wake, which is a completely different format. And then we have somebody like Virginia Woolf, who will take that and through the use of memory will always project towards the future what was the past. Yes, the format is absolutely crucial, I completely agree, and is something that can actually inform the tools of architectural representation.
And liberate us from language prison.
Sorry?
And liberate us from the language prison.
I don't see the Wittgenstein statement as a language prison.
There's a limit, according to Heidi, that that's it.
That's how, Heidi, did you mean it that way? I didn't feel it that way.
No, I think what, that sends me back into this kind of
because
academic jargon that somebody's so allergic.
If I need to, I have a Mexican quote to answer to this question.
No, go for it, go for it.
Because Octavio Paz, Octavio Paz says that we are language, we are ungraspable without language as human beings, and because of language, we are able to participate in the reality that only is possible because of language. And I find that extremely liberating.
And I'm going to go after Octavio Paz, and I'm going to go back to Wittgenstein, because obviously when I mention Wittgenstein, I'm also referring to his own limitations, you know. So when you have the world view determined by linguistics, right, and discourse, well then, yes, the words that you use, world, or world. Once you get insights on how, for instance, the world, the one world model that we're all in, is constructed in some important ways with the little building blocks of language, so linguistics and semiotics and so on, you start to question, and you also start to be a little bit critical about how this world that we inhabit and that we think is inevitable and is irreplaceable and is all-encompassing, ubiquitous, right? How it is actually constructed, and then say, well, if that is how this world is what other worlds are possible? So what Wittgenstein was actually pointing to us, I believe, is in the limitations of our own language. The limitations of our language also limit very much our playgrounds, where we live and how we live is a reflection of how we think, how we speak, you know? So if language is essentially, in a way, limiting and limited, what other kind of expressive means do we have? And I think that's where design comes in. So whether it's appropriate or not to talk about this, we're not, we're not writers, and I guess we're all designers in a sense, right? So when we think about that and we talk about representations, right, and architectural representations and the sections and elevations and, and perspectives and so on, I think that at some point it is like questioning what Wittgenstein asked us to do, perhaps, or techniques of representation have stayed behind to a world that is by far closer to what the Y factory is seeing, which, if I don't recall this wrongly, is also called the future cities, right? So it's how do we imagine our world is no longer representable by language alone. We need to imagine and come up with different techniques and different tools.
Right?
Sorry.
I don't want to intervene in this discussion about whether we are language or not language, but given that we are in the country where Spinoza lived, I certainly would think that there are things that come before and after language, certainly affect, and we relate to futures and to each other in ways that I think exceed language. So I'm just going to put that there and gingerly walk away, and actually go back to the question.
Run.
Yeah. I know, I've seen what happened to Felix. I'm going to watch myself. But I do want to take it back to the question of expertise and say that we are all futurists in our everyday life. We live, a lot of our activities, our everyday mundane activities, are actually shaped by our anticipations of very short-term effect and some long-term effects. Sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes of our future assumptions, of us being anticipatory or anticipating organisms, right? Like, so on a very kind of biological level, we always are open to the future and we relate to it. And I think, what futurists do that perhaps the everyday person doesn't, and again, I want, this could be qualified in so many different ways, is actually open up some of those anticipations and some of those assumptions to some critical thinking, hopefully, to the kind of a baggage that comes with every way that we think about the future. Going back to that quote that my own quote that you threw at me before, and so they have tools that allow us to think about the future maybe in more structural ways. For me, if we're going to talk about tools, right, then we're opening up here a conversation to think about tools in a very generic way, and so. I want to suggest that good tools are convivial tools, following Ivan Illich. So tools that put at their forefront the question of human survival, the question of justice and equality and equity, and the question of self-actualization, right? So convivial tools really lend themselves for us to make use of them in ways that really maximize our collective benefit, right? Not all futuring tools do that. Not all futuring tools are open to the lay person to kind of really understand what's happening there, the type of data, going back. By the way, I feel like I'm miscast here. Just because I use the word data doesn't mean that I'm a data fetishist of any sort. Certainly, yeah, those who know me.
Actually, data is really important.
It's okay to like data.
The word that you use that I think it's worth coming back to is enabling. Right? Because that's a fundamental turn, at least within built environment design education, where it has always been very much about the generation of a product or a solution versus the generation of ideas that enable a different way of seeing, a different sort of perspective on the question at hand. And so I think that's a fundamental shift in design pedagogy that is happening at this moment, that we're not yet contending with what does it mean for design to be an enabling enterprise versus a service provision.
Yeah, 100%, and we should acknowledge that most of the work that goes under futuring is meant to maximize profit. And most of the work that goes in design faculties is meant to, you guessed it, maximize profit.
But here's the question then, what is profit? And isn't it time to rethink and rediscuss the whole idea of profit?
100%.
100%. So I love the fact that you bring in anticipatory. So it goes from slogans to cliches, platitudes, anything. The T-shirt with the future is female, as long as the anticipatory messages, bring that or help us to bring closer new understandings of what profit means, perhaps understanding profit through a reworked concept of what is productive, right? So how productive is profit? Well, how can we make the future work more and better towards a common good, right? So I think we're going into the politics of it, but the anticipatory thing is super important because we're used to being retrospective.
But what is better?
Better is a problem. Better is a problem because it's a moral judgment, right? So we're going to come close to this, what I want to call axiologies, right? But we can also call about value.
We need to define the A word.
The axiology word is, well, you know, as any Greek speaker would say, axiology is what it means is an axis of value. And if you don't have values, you cannot orient, and you cannot direct. In fact, you can't imagine action. So profit, in a sense, is a very nice and very strong axis of a certain value system, of a certain world. Arturo Escobar calls it the one world model, right? So around this axis called profit, you know, or production or progress, we kind of let the entire world and the entire constellation of what the world is form. So our action plans are based on that understanding.
Yes, he wants to jump in. I can tell.
Yes, but he's
Yeah.
he's a
Well,
gentleman.
it was a bit back, I think, in the conversation. So I rethink where it was exactly, but I think it was Roy saying something about sort of how futuring is oriented. And I think so. Also in the invite for this talk, I think it says something about speculative futuring and about like how can we actually build different worlds. And I think one of the things that I think is actually key to understand to what Roy said about how futuring is part of our daily life, that at the same time, a lot of the creative, or actually I think the things we participate in, also the sort of critical practices, are often sort of separate out as a sort of separate practice. So it's very common to come across somebody making a distinction between working on the present and working on the future, as if it are two separate things. And I think for those relationships to become critical to the way we imagine the future and actually relate to the world. So the question then is how to bring them into contact. And I think it's really good to understand the really critical mechanisms through which our relationship to futuring and critical futuring is actually constantly sectored out. So talking about the visionary, for example, or the institute that is doing futuring, having a separate room for it. And actually, so I think thinking about the dramaturgy and the choreography and who is invited is then so crucial. And how does it become emancipatory for a certain group in a certain situation? What kind of relations of power are actually questioned in an act of futuring? Or is it just futuring for the sake of futuring itself, right? And I think we are really running the risk of following sort of a fashionable trend, which then just supports, I think, what Roy is also pointing at.
Yeah, so
it's one of my, may I? Yeah, it's one of my concerns always with the students, because they're always very eager to jump into design and think of the future and imagine the future. And sometimes I wonder how much attention we pay to the present and how much attention we pay to the place in which we're supposed to build, in which we're supposed to respond, in which we're supposed to interact with. Sometimes we look too fast, I'm afraid, in the future for the sake of future alone, while the present has a thick moment, is a thick moment, carries parts of the past and parts of the future in, and understanding it deeper and like finding the right tools to really study it is something absolutely crucial, and maybe is a kind of an answer towards what can be appropriate for the future. So it's always a very interesting experimentation with the students while of course you're in a school of architecture, in a department of architecture, you are here to dream of the future, to imagine for a new world, to imagine buildings that are not yet here. How much can we still ground them into the present in order for that future to come?
I'd like to say something in that sense, because it is again through not thinking otherness, but to think otherwise and to act otherwise, that I think that happens in students of architecture, and is to continuously remind them that no matter whether they're speculating into the future 400 years or 20 years, they are working from the transformative power of the present. So we're sitting in the present, no matter what it is that we're doing, whether we're not designing for the past, we're designing always allographically. So we're projecting things into the future constantly. That is what our task is. I mean, we're the midwives of the new, right? So really, without designers, without architects or spatial, planners or so, the new cannot ever come, it can never arrive. So I suppose that for students to be aware that what they're doing, they're actually working on the present and the transformative power of the present might be one of the ways to achieve a future-oriented design, perhaps.
Yeah, I think I don't know too much about the field of architecture, but like if I would make an analogy with the fields I work in, it must be sort of kind of a source of cynicism if there is actually this creative futuring, imagining going on, but then at the same time, architectural competitions are constantly, those sort of fancy future ideas only become a sauce for like the ideas that were just being sold in a competition, and it's just a dance around certain financial interests, right? So I think, and it's not often the case, but I think it's really important in any field, whether it's in architecture or any other, to understand those connections between futuring as actually a power field and just your daily practice and the competitions you participate in or are going to participate in the future.
Can I add something? I think we should acknowledge that we work in fields that pursue coolness and innovation for innovation's sake all the time. So, right, so profit and egos and prestige and whatnot, right? Like it's part of what we do. I want to just quickly say that I think the desire to bring non-experts into futuring, right, has to do with how we see the benefits of futuring. So you mentioned what is better before, and I think this is exactly what futuring can help us do. It could help us think about what we mean or what we pursue as better by extending the kind of ethical and moral horizon to 7 generations in some indigenous, societies believed in. What Krasnari calls, being good ancestors, right? So there's a real opportunity to extend what we even take for good with futuring, and this is one of the reasons that I believe that futuring should not be something that just experts do, but something that might benefit all of us.
I want to say something, I can't help myself, because I agree totally with you. And to Jesse, what these competitions do, in my opinion, is that they display, they display it for everybody to see, the reproduction of the same. So it looks innovative. There are flashy, glossy, sexy images. There's the, flying, feel like there's flying. There's some gestures towards, But it's not when I say otherwise, I'm not mentioning, or when I say that design can bring about the new, I'm talking really about how generation of species evolve, right? And it is through heterogenesis. It's through the alternation of generations and change to be happening. So I guess that happens by talking about it, by looking at it, by designing things, by making students aware, by a collective relational project.
Yeah, but that
sounds great, but I mean.
Yeah, but there are some kind of indirect insinuations that the Y Factory is only like speculating on flying stuff. But what I mentioned, the Y Factory, we don't have a format that has been tested, repeated again and again. Like, again, the Ego City, actually the name Ego City, that was exactly a kind of Darwinistic. It was a kind of an experiment of, even Vinny doesn't like it. He's like, no, let's call it the Ego City. No, let's call it Ego City because I want to test the limits of what happens. Excuse me. We wanted to test how humans will interact when they're competing for resources, no? And this is spatial resources in architecture. So that's why we were using computation tools, but in a kind of lab where students will fight against each other in a kind of common room. Everybody will be playing against each other. And at the end, you have a kind of beautiful result. Yeah, there are some losers, unfortunately, and many winners. And at the end, you could say it's a collective win because you can have a kind of beautiful utopia of density, but many people end up in the Y Factory Ego City research having terrible houses as well. But it's a kind of simulation of that. So it's not about imagining a future, like the flying thing, again, was a kind of research about how humans could relate to each other in a kind of social way. So all of these experiments take a lot into account what are the social interactions that can be simulated, because we are unpredictable to a certain extent.
I find it wonderful that you start with language. It's the Ego City. That's really guiding the process. I find it fantastic.
Yeah. It's the futuring. So it's like making students aware of a trend or a process in which we are all sitting, I think, constantly, which is defuturing our own futures. So when you say that, no, I was not insinuating, because I don't think the Y factor is the only, let's say, collective that is proposing flying saucers or flying cars or whatever.
It doesn't matter if it's flying. It's a research on format.
I was not insinuating any of that in that direction. In fact, I think that without the pioneers, the visionaries, so no, the calling of the visionaries, many of the things that we have now that we actually take for granted would not exist. So in that sense, I'm totally open for that. This is what I mean. You bring about the new. If the new is birthed, if you like, it's like the midwife of that new, comes through a questioning of these egocentric models and produces some kind of ecological practice, fine.
That's why scientists said we behave like. So let's listen to science for once, you know.
Can we maybe introduce a distinction between fantasy and imagination here? Would that be useful? And so, you know, an accusation of flying buildings as fantasy would mean, yeah, it's fanciful, it does nothing. But to say that it's imaginative means that it brings some sense of constraints, right? That it somehow corresponds to the real world and therefore triggers a productive thinking, right? So a lot of architecture is fantasy and is not imagination.
Exactly.
And ego.
Javier just mentioned, like, the research of a zero gravity, it's like evolution, you know, like it's like Darwinism. Like, you change the environmental factors and then you will have to adapt to it. So what the humans will do to adapt to that environment that has zero gravity, and then you research how humans will change their behavior and their architecture, perhaps. And then perhaps you can learn some things, you know.
So for me, it brings up this question of sort of considering the systemic versus considering the space of architecture. And in many ways, to me, the utility of speculative design within the built environments is an opportunity to reflect on the potential society that might occupy said space, or an alternate economy that might exist. It's actually not about the new. It's not the new in the physical, it's the new in the systemic. And so I wonder as going back to this question of representation, thinking about the product. What are the things that are being made? Are they images? Are they artifacts? Are they stories? Because at the end of the day, they're about a momentary representation of a larger set of systemic concerns. I don't know, Hesse, you're sort of nodding.
They're about relations.
Ecologies, one might even say.
Yeah, I was again going to say Arturo Escobar has that down to a quotable phrase, you know. So all creation is emergent, it's relational, you know, and it's collective. So. But it was not mine.
So I was also just nodding because I really liked the way you phrased it. I think, and I kind of lost my my thought pattern. But I think what for me sort of brings back the relationship to the present, and how we relate to the present in a really different way, right? So how is speculative futuring actually enabling us to think really different about it, to give us really an alternative experience of the world and how relationships can be like. And I think I think what we then perhaps often forget is what it actually takes and how difficult it is to for a moment at least take people out of their everyday expectations and leave them behind and experience an alternative storyline and an alternative experience. And I think, so for us, that comes also back to the, I think, question of rigor. I don't work in a built environment, but we started with students building a museum of the future. And then the students then would act as the curators of the museum, and they would tell storylines, and then we would have policymakers and people living nearby participate in that future event. But then for the entire afternoon, the moment they opened the door and came in, we made sure they felt as if they were in 2050 or so. And then throughout the entire 4 hours, we stuck to that. So we made sure that nothing came in the way of that performed storyline. And that was just an experiment, but it worked really well. And I think being that rigorous in really setting up a different kind of world and taking people along in that experience, but then also ideally not just students, but also policymakers or people walking nearby, I think is then crucial to really become a part of that.
It makes me think that in some ways, where one experiences a future matters a great deal, right? There's one thing to be in a gallery and to see a video playing or to pick up an artifact. It's another thing to move into a space where a certain reality has been suspended and there's a commitment to a sort of fictional alternate that's in there. It's a other thing to be in your neighborhood and to be on your street or on your block in terms of experiencing that thing. So I wonder, going back to this question of audience and of enabling, I'd like to bring up the sort of the where and the how of interaction, of engagement with the future, with futures, not the future, because it's plural.
But it's a systemic question. So it's again, I don't know. I'm going to try to base this like this thing that I want to say on Terry Irwin, and this what I think is a really clever way of explaining how we can future better. So he says there are socio-technical systems, right? And then we also have wicked problems. And I think part of our problem is that we don't know how to phrase, we don't know how to identify what our problem is. So we're talking about the future, like very vague things about this is wrong and we should do it, but we really don't really know exactly what the problem is. So, but in bringing these two kind of spheres together, socio-technical stuff and relations and systems and so on, and wicked problems, we see that they kind of overlap in scales. They overlap in, interchanges and interactions, interconnectedness. I mean, a lot of things that bring the systems that we normally wouldn't see, they bring them together. So, for example, she gives a really good example of, burglary, So where this happens, it happens in your home. Then you come up with all sorts of solutions to this problem, But once you zoom out into that and you start seeing that the burglary is actually a small little tame problem, that is one of the last in the chain of wicked problems that have to do with, I don't know, distribution of justice, distribution of wealth and so on, but cannot be solved by one discipline alone, obviously. Sure. So where I think I'm heading, and she kind of also says it, but everybody who's into transition design or even ontological design is really claiming this very loudly nowadays, is that there is no other way to do this except through transdisciplinary encounters. So again, the hyphen between all our thinking, and the hyphen between all our doings. So this transdisciplinary approach that would answer that question of where, in academia, for instance, where, but it also would help us to understand the how, right? How do we identify a question? How do we put a problem? And how do we share these problems with our areas of expertise? So,
Chris, the question of where we find futures is a common accusation of speculative design, that it's in the gallery. It breathes rarefied airs, right? And I think there's a lot of value in bringing futuring and speculation to the public, or more so to publics, and also as a means to create publics, right? So you bring the future everywhere. Well, the future is everywhere, but you foreground it, right? There's a kind of background-foreground game that's happening here, and it's one thing that I think designers and architects are kind of good in doing, because they understand form in ways that I think are richer. And so, that's kind of one thing. The second thing is what Jesse was describing, right? Getting the feeling is exactly what Angeliki was talking about the novel, and this is diegesis, right? Jargon alert, right? So there's a kind of a level of diegetic consistency where all the pieces fit together and create a world. Some say worlding. I prefer world making because, depends on which philosopher you're reading and kind of where you position yourself. But I think that there's value, right, in bringing the future in ways that are felt, that are not just linguistic, but actually ways that are affective and are emotional and should be distributed to everyone and should be made by everyone as well. So that's another point. So, a designer who creates an object and then puts it in public, is better than putting it in the gallery. But it's even better if the creation of the object that embodies this future world is done in collaborative ways as well.
Christopher? I have to work for my dinner, so you worked for your flight, enough, it's okay. Following up on these wonderful comments, it's the question about the where and the other and all, and about literature once again. It's not only that literature, and yes, of course, it's a linguistic means of representation of reality, we know that, but if we go beyond that, it really communicates the emotional reality. And this is a really big conversation when it comes to sharing emotions, to be part of a world that is full of emotions, of atmospheres, and we are attuned into these atmospheres. There's a particular atmosphere in this room right now as we speak. Particular actions can happen right now because of a certain atmosphere, and we all feel that. And authors are amazing in communicating these atmospheres of the environment, in buildings, in spaces, in relation to space, because it's not just atmosphere and space work together, and that's a great value when it comes to the contribution that literature can do for our profession. But also the interdisciplinarity, I want to take it into a level that really has to do with something we already discussed, the capacity, either as architects, as designers, but the capacity of every human to imagine themselves in somebody else's position. We talked about that already in our preliminary conversation, and Richard Kern, in The Wake of Imagination, in this wonderful book, he says that it's because of imagination that as human beings, we have the capacity to act ethically, or unethically, if you want to twist, right, the conversation. It's because we can imagine what it means to be an expat, a student living in a tiny little small, apartment, and you miss home, but at the same time you're struggling with your courses and your supervisor is really getting in your nerves. It's because we can imagine all that we can start thinking of designing like a student housing that is not just a place to store students, you know.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
No. It makes me think, I mean, Heidi, your comment earlier about what is it that collectively society is able to understand? It's stories, right? It's storytelling. And in some ways it goes back to literature. And I'm reminded of the argument about the elevation versus the model versus because in many ways, the description of the thing is less critical than the relationship and how it is experienced and sort of that notion of narrative as a way of expressing an idea of the future versus showing you the thing or producing the drawing or the video. There's storytelling that becomes potentially very powerful for this idea of enabling a public to engage with a set of ideas.
I can't help it, but Donna Haraway has said it better than anybody else. I think she's quoting one of her colleagues as well, but she says it matters what stories we use or we tell to tell the stories with. I think this is super important because we can talk about the apocalypse again, you know, and we can talk about the future and any other meme or, you know, motive that we like, but it matters what it is that we say about those things, and it matters literally, so it matters as in matter, you know. So I guess storytelling is everything in a way. Where did or how did our ancestors understand that the way that the world, let's say this world was not going well, from the utopias, you know, the critical aspects of utopia would be a pedagogical thing, would be educational and so on. So of course, storytelling is important. I think nowadays, pulp fiction, super important, film is super important, you know, narratives,
I want to
slogans.
go a bit to the discussion of time because
temporality.
it's kind of critical besides the format, and the aspect of time is very critical in the way, and I don't know like if it's that starts this linearity of differentiation with capitalism and the discovery of the Americas and so on, which got a kind of completely different narrative. No, the Mexicans were like trying to fight the Europeans as a kind of like dressing very elegant and like making this performance because, you know, it was kind of a cyclical thing. They couldn't foretell that this is actually something that is going to transform their lives forever, you know, like they thought that this is just, it's part of the ritual, it's cyclical, it will just come once and again and we have to be ready for it, you know, like, and the reading of that linearity, I don't know if it comes with capitalism, but you might maybe, who is an expert on that? But I'm curious of that.
Well, the expert is Manuel de Landa, another Mexican, I believe. Like, if you want to know everything about why you know, capitalism or actually the West is linear, or why it worked in linear chronologies, 1,000 years of nonlinear history is a book to read. But I like the idea that you bring in temporalities, duration, time with colonization. So when you say the stories, it matters what stories we tell. It also matters how we colonize these spaces, these ideas, and these temporalities. So yes, absolutely. So the project of the future should be coupled, and I mean it should be, I'm being prescriptive in this, it should be coupled with an impulse to decolonize these entire projects. You know?
Can I ask, I mean, just to follow up on that, colonization, implication of power, implication of control, but having the time to think about the future is a privilege. It's an enormous privilege, right? Like this is.
You need money for that, right? But that's I don't know. There's one slide running around here that is the Martian running around with the stone from Mars. To me, that is what is the danger, that this becomes a planetary and even cosmic kind of running out. So time is running out. Our resources are running out, sustainability is no longer. So we go and colonize, like in images, in ideas, in possibilities, we go and colonize the universe, right? So that's why I'm putting forward the ideas of pluralism, you know, and the pluriverse, and there should be enough space and, aperture. So appropriateness is important, but also aperture and attunement to be able to coexist in these scenarios.
I think there's a strong fit between some forms of futuring and what we're talking about here. If we think of futuring as the mission of futuring as pluralizing. So there's no future, there are futures. There's no present, there are presents. And even more radically, there's no past, there are pasts. And once we open up all this temporality, suddenly any notion of linearity, and by the way, you can test this, ask anybody to kind of draw a timeline, right? It's a timeline. We are taught that time moves in a particular way, and in fact, mostly from left to right as well. So it's kind of interesting. Look at all future cones. They're all drawn, the aperture or whatever, the opening is the same side. Very interesting. So I think part of what we want to do is we want to pluralize. And the question of who has time, I think, is a bit of a tricky question, because as I've indicated before, we are all thinking about the future. The question is, how do we do it, under what conditions, under what constraints? And I want to bring here maybe a notion that currently Cassie Robinson is pushing, the notion of imagination infrastructures, which goes back to Alvin Toffler and to others. So the idea that a good society would have an infrastructure that would allow everyone to come together and think about the future. Not just once every 3 or 4 years when you vote somebody and they make pie in the sky promises, but on a regular basis. What a beautiful idea.
There are moments, Claude, like that happen, and that actually allows the participation of the public that we keep hinting at, but we don't really discuss right now. There are moments that happen that all these multiple futures are actually guided, designed, defined by how the products, the work, the things we design and we put out there are actually appropriated and are actually used by the users. We all remember the time, even my students who are like 22 or 23, that when we had to type the letter C with the first cell phones, we had to push the number 2 3 times. Remember those times in these texts? Because when they were designing the first cell phones, they never thought that text messages will become such a popular means of communication. And that's because the users really love that possibility, that capacity, and that's why we have the new cell phones. That's why the keypad is such an absolute, because that was a reaction. That was really not the most convenient way to write a text. It was really slow, and still people did it. It didn't matter if it was convenient, it didn't matter. It actually hit a vein of a way of communication that was very desirable, very plausible by the people who are actually using that. And we keep forgetting that quite a lot.
Yes, I really like this discussion, because it also comes back again to sort of futuring as a futuring for the sake of futuring, or connecting it to something that actually matters to all of us. And it made me think of a design studio we did with landscape designers and scientists on future farming in the north of the Netherlands. Well, to cut a long story short, about really thinking about different types of landscapes and really engaging farmers in rethinking their farming practice. And yeah, it took us really a year of really hard work to in that space that was created with the researchers and the landscape architects to get sort of farmers involved and to have them step off their usual everyday reasoning of what their milk price is and what they expect for the coming 20 years and what they have invested in, to actually open up a bit for a mere sort of fiction or idea that their own future is plural. So I think to really create the spaces in which that becomes possible, and the hard work that you have to do for that, I think is really important. And it's not, I think that's not something between privilege and non-privilege, but it's more, I think, something that's under pressure. And I think also, I think a broader discussion about how we deal with fiction today. So how there's so little room for fiction today. Everything has to be factual. So how do we actually create, and I think that's creating spaces where people trust each other enough to allow some room for fiction is a big achievement.
It's really lovely that you bring in actually the North European farmer. Because when I'm thinking about the pluriverse, I'm thinking about the Amazon, about native knowledges, about, you know, the colonized, you know, the subaltern. And that you bring in this kind of mode is fantastic. There should be a space for everyone, right? For every kind of the constellation of all our worlds to be able to inhabit this verse that is more than a pun, I guess. It's not just a verse as in a poem. It's a multiverse, if you like.
So we're nearing the point in time that questions might come from the audience, but I want to open it to the five of you. If there is something that you really were jazzed about talking about this afternoon and we didn't get to, or I have another question, but I did want to turn it back to the five of you if there's anything that, I know, Roy, you had something that you had to get off your chest.
No, actually not really. I think we talked about so much today. This was such a beautiful, sprawling conversation. I feel like we can go for several more hours and not even, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg. But can I finish maybe well, you can ask whatever you want, but just a brief quote from Zadie Smith, who says, "Time travel is a discretionary art, a pleasure trip for some, and a horror story for others."
Maybe I should not say anything. I don't have a quote. No, but there's many things for me that are missing in the discussion. I'm sorry to say it, but there's the idea, a lot kind of believe in architecture that the city is like a house and that everything, all scales are somehow connected. And I think we have not understood the idea of scale. And for simulation or for predicting things, even climate change and modeling, it's so important. And we have no clue how to deal with these things. So there's so many things that we need to improve in the faculty to understand what it means to have a room or 100 houses or 1 million, etc., because things are not linear, you know, like, and going back to the Lambda, you know, like, things are more complicated than we think. Yeah?
But I think in that regard, accepting the impossibility of comprehensiveness is actually fundamental to what architecture and the built environments need to become. This idea that we can account for everything is,
I agree. We don't have to predict the whole thing, but certain targets should be there, no? Like, or not. I mean, maybe we don't predict the whole thing, but perhaps we could try to put some targets, and maybe we don't arrive the same way or in different formats, but would be nice that we have still a planet for humans in the future, no?
Well, to do that, I think that I totally agree. Again, agree and agree and agree, but I do agree, and I think a very important part to achieve that is to learn how to problematize. So to identify and frame and poke and stay with the trouble, right? So identify problems, be able to phrase them in a way, and then start thinking about the tools and the methods that we need collectively to start poking those problems, ask the right questions, and then start to think about solutions. This kind of aversion we have to solutionism seems to me like a trend, to be honest. So that's where I was, heading a bit.
With 2 minutes left, that's a big one to drop.
Did I convince you?
I think Heidi, the point about asking questions, that is in some ways where to me, this lies, is that it's in asking questions in multiple and not looking to respond to those questions, but asking additional questions. And I don't think that's about solutionism. I think it's actually a fundamentally, at least again within the built environment disciplines, a fundamentally different way of operating than the way architecture and landscape and planning have operated for, at least within modernism.
Right, and it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Can I just sort of one last thing on confirming what Felix said is that sort of as a social scientist coming to a geoscience faculty where you have physical geographers and sort of people know modeling what will happen to the Netherlands in the coming 60 to 100 years, sea level rise-wise. So I also have these cliche images of the expert in my mind, but then working with their insights and their scenarios, yeah, that has really been path-breaking. So they actually were the ones to really help me ask what-if questions. So I think, yeah, I think you're completely right, and I think that sort of that interdisciplinary conversation also really needs to invite or reach out to those kinds of experts, and yeah, so I think that was a great comment.
Yeah. If I may, one last comment as well. I agree with all these beautiful kind of concluding remarks. Since the very beginning, when I got the invitation from Javier, I was kind of wondering why the subtitle is "Before It's Too Late." I found that as a very dooming, very, who cares if it's too late? It's not about being too late. I think it's already too late. We're beyond that, thank God. And then we can actually be free and liberated and imagine the future. And enjoy imagining the future and being happy about imagining the future. I don't know that too late if it's adding anything to this conversation or if this conversation would have been any different if it was already too late.
Yeah, we don't have to solve it. It has to be done by everyone. At the end, it cannot be done by just one of us.
What a great way to finish. It's too late.
So I do want to open it up for questions if there are any from the audience. I do think that's a nice moment to end on, and to your point, Rory, we could go for hours if we really wanted to. But yeah, whether online, if there are any that popped up, or anybody in the audience, something we addressed, something we skipped, observation. But as I said, I think hopefully you all have been sort of thinking through this with us as we've kind of sprawled across this last 90 minutes.
I'd like to invite anyone, if they have a question, to come down here, if you want to ask one. If not, I would like to ask a question. Well, I think that the discussion about the future, and you kind of touched upon this, it's kind of linear, isn't it? And I think I started to think about this paradox of the future where I want to ask, how do we as designers know when the future has been won? Or how do we know, when we're deciding things, how do we know that this is the right way?
We don't know. Only numbers can tell at the end. That's why I really think that we have to study evolutionary theory, much more than we, in high school, no. Go back to there because there's a lot of mathematics going on there. We really have to understand how it works.
I want to say something to that. We have to understand how it works. That's why we're in a technological university, and that's why you're putting so many hours, flight hours, into learning the precision of our guild, of our craft and our kind of discipline. But I also want to appeal to you and all students to trust yourself in this one very simple. It's a very simple premise. You feel, and then you think. And this is what's called sentipensar in Spanish. You think, feel, with the affect. So there is an intention, and the intention, you can follow it. So and you feel, and then you know what you're doing.
I don't know. I don't feel climate change, sorry. I don't feel it.
But it's not about climate change.
Did you see the weather
I can think about it,
how do you know what the future? It is simple as inhabitation, right? It doesn't have to be a climate change issue or something that you cannot compute or that is too big, what Timothy Morton will call a hyperobject. Just simple design, a simple design, very honest, simple design. How do you know if what you're putting out there allographically into the temporality of the future is appropriate.
I was about to say, the question is not about right or wrong. You're torturing yourself with that if you're thinking like that. It's always an issue with architecture when you study, and I remember myself as a student thinking, oh, is that right? I now teaching, we need to take the conversation beyond what is right or wrong. It's not at all. This is not the question.
Yeah, but she wants to be in the winning side. It's obvious. It's normal, you know.
The winning side is the side that survives, I guess.
Exactly. That's why we are predicting things, because we want to be in the winning side. I mean, hello.
So we need to be there for posterity. It's a fear about the future, right?
It's being dominant.
Okay.
There was one, like your question started off with linear and a future, and I think what is interesting is that the idea of the future is a very modernistic idea, and also from sort of Western Europe and in the Netherlands, Fred Polak, the futurist, is a really modernistic guy, or he was. So I think in a way your question is right, but that I think it's only about that idea where it comes from, but then still perhaps it is a useful construct that we want to critically look at. And I agree with what's being said. So sort of there's not one way to go about that. So, but having a conversation about the future may help you very much in thinking about a lot of things that are happening today. But it's also good to be critical about where the idea in the first place came from.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting conversation. So what I missed a little bit in the conversation was this question of why we are thinking about the future. And I think this is what you just mentioned, you know, kind of like, you know, points to it, but it's not exactly it. And I think this is also what differentiates architects when they think about the future, and maybe, you know, people who write novels. So I think my answer is, and that's what I work with students often tell them, is that we think about the future because we think we can proactively change it. And so I think, and this should really structure our thinking about the future and should discipline us in how we think about it. And when we think, I mean, when architects, I was saying like the differences between architects and you know, people who are working in literature and novels, I think architects think about the spatial conditions that enable certain futures. And that's a little bit different, I think, than when we think about maybe gravity-defying architecture and that kind of stuff. So if we're thinking about like what kind of spaces do we need in order for certain futures to probably happen, that's a little different than, you know, imaginative thinking that kind of like puts certain variables, you know, in a different way. So just maybe trying to add on to the discussion.
Maybe we think about the future because the future is already thinking us in a way, that it asks us questions all the time, whether you're looking at religion or whether, you know, children always ask, what am I going to do when I grow up? How am I going to look like? We as beings that are influenced by the passing of time and seeing change, we always think about where that change is going. To me, what I see now is this kind of golden age of futures, right? Like everybody's talking about the futures. Why are we doing it now? I think is even is a more even provocative question. Well, we're doing it because we feel that the future is being taken away from us.
Yeah, but I think there's also a subtle difference. I think when we consider that we really can make a difference about the future, I mean, I think this is driving us in a way to think about the future, but also that links to the question who is thinking about the future and who's not able to think about the future because they are kind of like really caught up in trying to find shelter and water and all the rest of it. So I mean, here we're very privileged to be thinking about the future because we don't have a war and all the rest of it.
We
so
do
I think
have
this
a war.
why and how it's very
We
much
do have a
related.
war.
Come again?
We do have a war.
We always have a war.
Not right here. Not in this. Not yet.
I wouldn't be so optimistic.
Thank you.
But yeah, I'm also sort of, I feel that I sort of want to reflect, and I don't know. So I'm going to say what I'm thinking right now. But so I think it refers back to Roy's point about how some sense of the future and futuring is implied in any practice, and that's also how in teaching and how you relate sort of as an architect to an assignment or how you go about your professional life. there are assumptions about what you're designing for and how you do that, what kind of media and techniques you use. And I think, so there is sort of that side, I think, of a relationship to the future. And then there is more futuring, at least as a broader domain, I think, for asking more, perhaps more critical questions and being more reflective about the world and taking responsibility in a different way. So what are the perhaps spaces in the Netherlands, like the natural gas distraction and the earthquakes in the north of the Netherlands, such an architectural problem, and how many architects are actually involved in thinking about that in terms of futuring. And I think that, at least that is for me what it is about, opening up that space in terms of how we go more in our routines about the future, to really critically rethink our responsibilities, our relationships, our engagement with the world.
I'm going to jump in there because you used one word that I think we should have also discussed, which is responsibility. So it's not the responsibility as in you're accountable for the future. So of course, as a woman, I'm going to tell you, why are we talking so much about the future right now? Well, to start up, because time's up, right? So structures of patriarchy, well, we're starting to see them. Why? Because the systems that support them are failing. That's a simple explanation. But if I just think about what it means to have a responsibility in this, is to have the ability to respond to that problem. So we can talk about climate change, or we can talk about earthquakes in the north of Holland, or we can talk about feminism and having, up to here with the patriarchies and systems of domination. But it is that we are now confronted to that question that we need to answer. And that's, I think, why everybody is in different ways and from different angles and from different expertise, levels of areas of expertise, interested in this question of the future. So Jesse said it too, it is this linearity of Western male, dominated societies that are starting to show cracks, interesting cracks. So we're asking the right questions, I believe, when we ask about the future. So it's not just like a trendy thing to ask, it's an important, really important question.
The future is the question, right? That's the platform that allows all these questions to emerge.
You may now drop your microphone.
Oh, I got plenty of those coming.
I want to say something, but it's a bit outside of this. But I have a feeling that that architects that look into the future are always like you make fun of them, no? Like you make the memes. Yeah, it's some people that you just laugh about. And even in the history of architecture, the guys who were really about futurists, like Buckminster Fuller, whoever, they were not so relevant at the end in the history of architecture. Yeah? Nobody, except for Rainer Banham or a few guys who really took them seriously, everybody just wants to hear about the main guys, Le Corbusier and so on. So it's never been considered like so important. The first time that I think that for a long time that something happened in a kind of very embarrassing way was the exhibition of mutations, when Rem and many colleagues, Sanford Quinter and so on, make this beautiful exhibition where basically show how the world is, and we were like completely powerless to this force. Is a document where it shows that architects play zero role in how the world is being done. So, like, while we have all discussions about the constructivism and whatever, the world just next to them was like, and now we are like 20 years later, like, oh, oops, now what do we do, So we don't take a look at the present. We make fun of the guys who look at the future, but we respect the guys who take the site and the context very seriously, which is important, I agree, but we have to give a chance to the guys who make speculations and who study the present in its kind of very brutal way, like.
Felix, I'm gonna be like the technical and the rudos, that it is not either or, it's both. So it doesn't have to be
When
exclusive.
is the prescript for future thinking? When is the prescript for future? It's only about materials, bamboo and brick. Like, please tell me, when is the recognition for future thinking? When?
It is always.
When
It is already. It was before. It is always. It cannot progress without the togetherness. So it's an and. That's why I brought in the process philosophies. It's a becoming. You cannot be one or the other.
You only respect the present. I'm sorry to say.
Isn't that what Elon Musk is selling us? Future is a hot commodity, man. You
Not
can
for
sell anything
architecture.
if you just splash on a little bit of future desire into that. So, I don't know, I think we fetishize the future to some extent as well.
It is yes, and, you know, it is and both.
I don't know, like who proved to be right? Like, could we give this recognition, like in retrospect, say, wow, maybe we should have listened to that guy, you know, like, or to that lady or whoever, you know, like, we don't really study what was the guys who were studying, like for other things, there's this Nobel Prize, you know, the guys who solve the food issue with inventing synthetic fertilizer, which is another problem, but they got the Nobel Prize. But the guys of architecture and urbanism that deal with the future, you just laugh about them because, come on, flying cities, haha.
So I'm going to say something different, but I thought it was a sort of nice summary. I think, so something that's, oh yeah, perhaps there's another question before so that I can come back to this point later. I don't know how much time we have, but otherwise we just ran on in this panel.
Why don't we take this question and then you can come back.
Hi, you talked about collective future making, and I was wondering, because in this discussion I heard like little concrete examples of how that would take shape. What's your view on that? Because you said it should be done more than 3 or 4 times per year, as it is now, or in the government. But how would you see that then? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think in that same modernistic period, there was actually a long tradition of having conversations around the future. There was the Futurama, or the World Exhibitions. In the Netherlands, there was the Energy 50/50 in Ahoy, which was like 1 in 3 people in the Netherlands went to visit that. So there was like an imaginary emerged that everybody embraced to some extent, with their own interpretations and variations and room for debate. Well, modernism, not too much room. And I think with everything that is sort of that we're now dealing with, also, so in any country context, but in the Netherlands, the housing crisis, the farming crisis, the energy transition, the needs, the sea level rise. I think at a more centralized level, but also in all different kinds of pockets, also from student initiatives, the classroom, the Y Factory, the Urban Future Studio, all sort of hopefully can sort of scaffold sort of a debate about the future that we want and that we can hope for, and that we can actually reach out far into the future, but also be very critical about things that we are doing right now, and it can take many different forms. And I think the exhibition, sort of the World Exhibition, was the form of the 20th century. And I think we're kind of still in an undecided moment of what the form is going to be. But what I really like is that it seems as if with that future, which was a really hot topic in the 1960s, you also see an interest to the provosts, the situationists, the people that went into the streets to do all kinds of happenings, to just make some. Also, Stuart Candy has this really nice futuristic interventions in the present, where the present and the future all become mixed up, and sort of the provost with the white bikes, or the problem that was in Amsterdam that everybody could use to problematize ownership. I think it can take many different forms, and it's also for yourself perhaps to decide on, and with teachers and college students and others, how to do that, how to contribute.
If I may add a quick note here, it's also that this discourse and these conversations are building up during time. Right now in the library here at UDelft, there is an exhibition about atomic energy that starts with a 1958 huge exhibition that took place in Schiphol here about nuclear energy that was seen only in an absolutely positive light. Only the good things that nuclear energy can bring from the future, 1958. We know right now that this is a very completely different story. So the discourse keeps being produced, being developed. That current exhibition is actually questioning that super positivistic look, that super encouraging that super bright understanding of that, and is looking what is happening now, and is looking in new futures that nuclear energy can bring. So it's not when or how many times a year. It's, I think, constantly during the time.
Can I just quickly comment? I think it's a matter of capacity and opportunity. So there are tools, there are ways to consider the future, capacities, literacies, whatever you want to call them. And we have them as children. We're very imaginative, and then they're beaten out of us by the education system that tells us, no, you have to prepare for a particular future that you choose now. That's your profession, right? Be a worker, earn. So there's some capacities that I think that we can encourage or at least maintain. And then there are opportunities that we don't have because nobody asks you about your future. Nobody asks you. Why not? Let's do it. Let's have imaginetic centers. Let's have these, these opportunities for people to come together and talk about the future. Even if we don't necessarily have the power to make this, decision-making power over the future, the more we do that, we will get a sense of the malleability of the future, the fact that we can affect it.
Thank you. I think we have one more question with time remaining.
Yes. I wanted to add something to or make a reflection on the question that Felix just posed. When do we give attention to the people that envision the future? And I don't have an answer. Maybe I have a suggestion. I was wondering if any of you is interested in quantum physics. Because I have this feeling, I started to read about that, and especially there is a book I've been reading, it's in Dutch, the Creatiespiral, so the creation, the spiral of creation. And in this book, he refers to the theory of relativity, in which we know that we can travel in time. And, but the thing is that you could think that the future is fixed, because if we can travel somewhere, this place is already there. But actually, what I learned from this book is that it is not about this, but every time that we envision the future, we create a future. So basically, it's like we are just like throwing, like something in the future that then pushes up towards itself. But this is also not fixed, because we can change, we change. So this is a process, but there is a power. There is a power in envisioning things, and somehow what we envision starts to get into the matter, as you suggested. And the more people envision something, the more we are attracted to this future. I think that the dialogue is also a very good way to do that. There is also a very interesting book, Over the Dialogue, from David Bohm. He's also a physician. The writer of the other book is also a physician, so people studying physics. I think that the physics are almost the new philosophers. No. So I don't know, maybe you want to add something on this.
I'm going to give you a reference that I think you're going to love. It's called Meeting the Universe Halfway. It's by Karen Barat, and it's exactly what you're saying. So she actually she's also a physicist, quantum physicist, feminist philosopher. And what her breakthrough book, like what she's actually saying in that book and in many other things, but she explains how our techniques of seeing is what makes the phenomena, like what we think that makes phenomena observable, is actually what creates the phenomena. And she explains it through the electron and the atom. So it is through observing them that they start to move. So that is very much into the performativity of queer physics. So it's Meeting the Universe Halfway, read it, and she's amazing. She's a fantastic philosopher, a great thinker.
So I think when we are aware of this, then this question you posed is not necessary anymore, you know?
Okay. Looks like we have one more question, very, very last one, and very quickly.
Try and be concise. It's kind of like a half-baked thought coming from the chats I've had with my friend is we talk about like opening the future up and having plural futures and imagining all of these different futures. But I feel like there's this kind of gut feeling that you kind of have to form consensus to be able to mobilize the future for action. And I'm just wondering, like, is it an either or? Are you opening? Can you use the future to mobilize people to act without having to form consensus on this is the one future we are pursuing? Or can you do that? And I know it's not a question you can really answer, but it's
I can answer to that very quickly. And it's again a reference. So in simple terms, this is terminology, but there's a thing called exclusive disjunction and inclusive disjunction. So an exclusive disjunction of the future would be, in very simple terms, dystopia or utopia, paradise or hell, right? It's either or, technophobia, technophilia. An inclusive disjunction would be to understand technology, for instance, as you cannot reduce it to either or, but it's also, so there are conditions of as well, and both. And this is a very interesting, very short and very accessible text by philosopher Claire Colebrook, and it's you can download it online. It's called Futures. So your question is answered in that text.
wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent. Javier, shall I wrap this up, or do you wrap this up in your... So I want to thank the five of you. This was great, great fun, as I knew it would be. And I look forward to continuing it at dinner, many of the conversations. And I want to thank everybody who has tuned in and is here in the audience for sticking with us on this, and hopefully has led to a little bit more thinking about the future for each of you. With that, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the beautiful conversation. This was a beautiful panel. So I think that we all agree, and we will be clapping in a couple of minutes. Just let me just be patient. I need my words. So I want to thank you for the appropriates, for the mythos, for the formats, for the elevations, for the languages, for the tools, anticipations, the flying, for the multiverses, for the time travels, for the what ifs, and for the too lates. Let's go for dinner and keep talking about this. I just need, it's my obligation before we leave to let you know what's happening next at BK Talks. So on June the 2nd, we are organizing a risky one. It is a risky one. It's called Is This True? Democracy, Autocracy, and Truth Forming, and what architectures got to do with it. It's a very complicated one, but thanks God, Roberto Rocco is co-organizing this with me. He's the diversity officer here at the faculty, and Caroline Newton will be moderating, so they both know very well what we are talking about. But just to give you a hint, and those at home give you them a hint as well, I would just read a little piece of what we have been thinking of. Manipulated social media, radical populism, and political cynicism fuel disinformation and untruth, corroding the public sphere and eating at the very core of democracy. Without shared truth-forming and true public reasoning, there is no agreement about how to face the biggest challenges of our times, and in this case, I would say of our future, which among others are climate change or growing inequality, and the fall of democracy itself as a viable project. So the panel on the 2nd of June will be aiming at finding some answers about the role of design in contributing to shared truth-forming about cities, communities, and I would say the built environment. See you on June 2nd. Thank you very much.